be a fun game. All right, we'll learn later that 6 years have passed from the time that Jacob and Laban entered into their agreement. The agreement that all of the spotted, mottled, and striped goats and the black sheep would be Jacob's. 6 years have passed. So they had the agreement early on, but remember that Jacob didn't trust Laban. Even in that, he didn't trust him. He knew who Laban was. He knew the type of man that he was. And so Laban throughout, and we'll look at this later, but throughout this 6 years, Laban changed Jacob's wages. The pure would be Laban's initially, but then Laban started changing it as he saw Jacob blessed. Jacob continued to be blessed. No matter what Laban did, Jacob was blessed. The Abrahamic blessing was on Jacob. The results of the Abrahamic curse were upon Laban. But notice that as Jacob is blessed, Laban takes offense. And so often we think, well, if God blesses me, then others will appreciate it too. Or if others think lowly of us, it's because we've done something wrong or because, and we make excuses. But take note, because being blessed by God does not mean that the world will appreciate what we are experiencing. The world will not appreciate what God is doing in our lives, because the world is opposed to God, and therefore the world is opposed to his work and his people. So it's no surprise here that Laban takes offense. Now Laban knew that his wealth had grown for the previous 14 years. The 14 years that Jacob worked for Rachel and Leah, Laban's wealth had grown. And Laban said, Jacob, I know that it's because God has blessed you that my wealth has grown. Laban knew. And he wanted him to stay for that reason. He didn't want Jacob to leave. Remember, he didn't want Jacob to leave because he knew that if he left, then Laban would miss out on a blessing. Now that that Laban's wealth is decreasing, he blames Jacob. So Jacob got credit when things were going well, and now he gets the blame when things aren't going well. But notice that Laban, didn't stop and think about why. Why, Jacob, was there this change? Why was I blessed before and I'm not being blessed now? He didn't ask Jacob what God was doing. He didn't try to look at what was going on. He didn't investigate at all. See, Laban was not at all interested in the eternal. He was interested only in material wealth. He was happy when things were going well, and he was angry when things weren't going well. He gave God credit when things were going well, but he's not going to reflect. He's not going to look. He's not going to investigate. He's not going to pray. He's not going to seek out a potential reason. Laban's not interested in the eternal. He's not interested in God. He's interested only in material wealth. Now, we sit here and we know the absurdity of this thought. Don't we? We know that wealth is not eternal. We know that it doesn't last. We know that you can't take it with you into the next life, and yet we fall into the same trap. We fall into the trap of more monies, more dollars, more possessions, more whatever. But yet we know that it's not right, and we still do it. Think about the fact that for the past thousands of years, Laban's wealth has been gone. Laban's wealth is not around. He lost it a long time ago when he died. See, Laban and his family are now in eternity. They are now facing the judgment of God. They are awaiting eternal hell. Jacob is being more blessed now than he ever was in this life. He is in heaven. He is with God. See, that's how short-sighted we can be. We know that this world is passing away. Jesus tells us to not store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven. Because the things of this world do pass away. I have said this before, one of my favorite places to drive by is the car junkyard on Route 8. It's on the east side of Route 8. I love driving past that, which I know sounds very weird. But it's such a reminder that moth and rust destroy. When you think every one of those cars was at one point something exciting for somebody to have, it's now just a pile of junk. It's now meaningless. It's now pointless. It's now worth nothing, maybe a few parts. But it's such a reminder of where are we building our wealth? What are we living for? So instead of reflecting on this, instead of looking into this, Laban's family, his sons, and Laban himself now claim that Laban has made Jacob wealthy. Jacob had made Laban wealthy. Well, God did through Jacob, and now that he's losing that wealth, the blame shifts quickly. Matthew Henry wrote, "Men's overvaluing worldly wealth is that fundamental error which is the root of covetousness, envy, and all evil." See, when they were looking at the material wealth that was going away, they became envious. They coveted. They looked upon Jacob with evil intentions. And so this is Jacob's situation with Laban. Again, Laban had seen Jacob as a blessing because of his wealth. Now he had no favor upon Jacob. His value of Jacob changed quickly, not because of who he was, not because he was his son-in-law, not because he was a hard worker. He looked upon Jacob now as no longer an asset, but a hindrance. See, the irony of Laban's anger and his mistreatment of Jacob is that his jealousy and mistreatment of Jacob cost him the greatest blessing his family ever had. He so wanted to grab on to the material wealth that he cost himself the very blessing that Jacob was. And we do this so often because this is what jealousy does. It blinds us to what is good. It prevents us from self-awareness. It takes our eyes off of God, and it brings us to a place of enmity even with those we love or should love, because we strive after the things of this world. And so it's in this situation that God spoke to Jacob. Verse 3, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." Remember, the Lord had appeared to Jacob at Bethel. When he's on his way to Haran, God appeared to him and said, "I will be with you, and you'll come back. I will be with you." God tells him, "I will be with you in the midst of the unknown, in the midst of your fear, of you don't know what's going on. I will be with you." Jacob waited patiently for God to bring him back. "Jacob, you're coming back." 20 years have passed, and Jacob had waited patiently. He dealt with a lot. He didn't try to force God's hand. He didn't run away. He waited patiently for God to bring him back. Know that in difficult situations, I often look at difficult situations and wonder, have I done something wrong? Am I outside of God's will, whatever that means? Am I facing these consequences because I've done something wrong, or I need to? See, often difficult situations are given to us by God. Difficult situations doesn't mean that we're outside of God's will. They could mean that we're actually right in the middle of it, where we are where we're supposed to be. Because God uses these difficult situations to teach us. As we've seen throughout the patriarchs, difficult situations are what God uses to work on our own hearts, to take our focus off of the things of this world and put them on Him. When we look around at the horizontal, we become overwhelmed. But when we take our eyes off of the horizontal and we put them on the vertical, when we put them on God Himself, the difficult situations melt away. Because we know that God is sovereign. We know that God is in control. It's here that we learn to trust Him and rest in Him. This is what difficult situations do. Now, we look at difficult situations in our life and we say, I wouldn't want to ever do that again, but I wouldn't want to live life without that experience. And that has been my experience. I don't want to relive certain things that I've had to live through in my life, but I look back and say, God, it's those very things that were so hard that you taught me so much. And this is what is happening with Jacob. But see again, in this God's graciousness, He knew the turmoil that Jacob had experienced. He knew the last 20 years. He knew that Jacob had to flee from his family. He knew that Jacob had gone through a lot, but he also knew that Jacob was going to experience more when he left. So God appeared to Jacob again and promised to be with him. Notice it's the same promise He had made at Bethel. I will be with you. I am with you. It's the same promise that Jesus made to His disciples at the Great Commission. I think about the Great Commission. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. If it ended right there, it's like a pull yourself up and get to work. But He doesn't stop there, because He says, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. See, Jesus knows the struggles we face in this life, especially as we try to live out the Great Commission. He calls us to act, but He promises to be with us. He doesn't say, go and do it, figure it out, you're on your own. These are your commands, try hard. No, He says, I'm with you. I will be with you to the very end of the age. He empowers us. He encourages us. He is with us. Hear this, no matter what you are experiencing in life. If you are a follower of Jesus, He is with you. Is there a greater comfort than that? Right? There are times in our lives where we experience great difficulties. And we look for somebody to be with us. We look for somebody to walk with us. We look for somebody to carry the burden with us. When I do funerals, I talk about how we all know what it's like to try to lift a physical burden. Right? Sometimes physical burdens are just too heavy for one person to lift. And so what do? We go and we find friends and we say, will you help me carry this? You know, the fascinating thing about this that we don't really think about is that the weight is still the same. It doesn't change the weight. The burden is still the same, and yet when we carry it together, we're able to do it. And this is what God knew Jacob needed. He needed to know that he was not alone. And so He said, Jacob, you're going to leave here. You're going to face some difficulties, but know that I am with you. The God of the universe, the one who spoke everything into existence, is with you, and He's with you. He is with you. You are never alone. So God speaks to Jacob, and then Jacob calls Rachel and Leah to the field. He calls them to the field because that's where they can have a conversation alone, away from everybody else. Remember, at this point, Jacob had servants. There were other people. He had a bunch of kids. He had other wives. There were a lot of people around, so he needed to have a conversation, a private conversation with Rachel and Leah. So he calls them out into the field. And he tells them that Laban, their father, had no longer regarded Jacob as he did before. Not only did Jacob hear what Laban's sons were saying, he saw Laban. He experienced him. He knew that Laban no longer respected Jacob. He had faithfully served Laban for 20 years. And for 20 years, Laban had cheated Jacob and changed his wages 10 times. We've seen this, right, where Jacob woke up and he was next to Leah instead of Rachel. That's a significant change of wages. They made the deal of the spotted and striped goats and the black sheep would be Jacob's, and Laban took all of them away so that the reproduction probably would not have spotted or striped goats. But Jacob tells us more. So they had this original deal. All the spotted, speckled, striped goats are yours, and all the black sheep are Jacob's. The rest would be Laban's. But Laban didn't like this. This wasn't working out well for him. And so he changed the wages throughout these 6 years. If the flock was producing a lot of spotted goats, then Laban said, all right, the spotted goats are mine now. You get the striped ones. And then what happened was the flock started producing striped goats. And so Laban then changed the wage again and said, all right, all the striped ones are mine. You get all the spotted ones. And it went like this 10 times. Each time the animal that Laban said would be Jacob's produced abundantly. So God made whatever Laban changed his wages to multiply. Isn't it fascinating that we think we can outsmart the Almighty? That we can outwit God? So God blessed Jacob and he cursed Laban and he prevented Laban from succeeding in his plan. Jacob learned that it wasn't the sticks in the trough that did the work. It was God himself. It was God who blessed Jacob and cursed Laban. See, there are no schemes of man. There is nothing that we can do that will stand in the way of God. And it is the utmost stupidity, idolatry, self-worth that we think we can outsmart God. Do you ever think, well, I need to pray about this, but I don't want to because I don't want to tell God what I've done, or I don't want to tell God what I'm afraid of because He knows. Like there is nothing that can stand in the way of the Almighty. Let us take comfort in that. See, we often get worked up about unfair actions or the plans of others. We want to be treated right, and that's a fair desire. We want to be treated right. And so when we're mistreated, we think, well, I need to get even, or I need to stand up for what's mine, or I need to fight for this, and the list goes on. And when we do this, we lose sight of the sovereignty of God when we get worked up about the unfair actions or the plans of others. It's because we have taken our eyes off of God and His sovereignty and His love for us. We need to stand up for our rights. We fight. We do whatever it is. We're afraid that if we don't stand up, then nobody will. Losing sight of the fact that God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. I got this. You need not worry about it because I got this. Would you rather you carry that burden, you carry that anger, or would you rather trust in God to deal with it according to His plan and His purpose? We're afraid that if we don't make things right, that God will allow us to needlessly suffer. But know that there is no needless suffering in this world. All things work together for good, for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. All things. You never have to worry about needless suffering because it will never happen with God. Yes, we will suffer. Yes, we will be taken advantage of. But no, it is never needless. So, Jacob had been mistreated. He continued to serve for the past 6 years, but 20 years in all. His time with Laban had been miserable. But he didn't demand his rights. He didn't fight about it. Instead, he trusted that God would protect him, and he did. The only reason Jacob could serve Laban for those 20 years is because he trusted in God. He knew who God was. God had made promises to him, and Jacob trusted. He knew the God he served. He knew that God would care for him. And when we focus on ourselves or our situation instead of the Almighty, our vision becomes distorted and is messed up. We lose sight of things. So let us focus not on the horizontal, not on our situations, but on who God is. See, Laban's complaint, what Laban didn't understand was his complaint was not against Jacob. His complaint was actually against God. He was unable and unwilling to look at this possibility. He was unwilling to even consider the fact that God had acted differently than as he wanted. Again, let us not think that if we receive blessings from God, the world will be pleased with it. The world is opposed to God. And so Jacob told Rachel and Leah about what their father had been doing. There's no doubt that they already knew this. There's no doubt that they hadn't seen any of this. They knew their father. They knew Jacob. They knew the worker that he was. Wives have a way of seeing how their husbands are treated. They see it, and there's no doubt that Rachel and Leah had seen this. So he told them about the dream that he had. An angel of God, the angel of God, spoke to Jacob. Remember, the angel of God is God himself. The angel of God is the second person of the Trinity, the pre-incarnate Jesus. We have seen this before. We'll see it again. God condescends himself, and he comes to earth to be with his people. He is not up there somewhere, just floating around doing whatever he does. No, he comes to earth with his people. He is not distant and far off. We've already seen in Genesis, God shows glimpses of what would happen later. And here the angel of God speaks to Jacob and says, I will be with you. He shows himself as coming to earth. He didn't become a man in Genesis, but he took the form of a man. Later, he'll fulfill this glimpse when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. God is showing a glimpse of what he would do later on. And so he said to Jacob, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. God is reminding Jacob of his promise to Jacob at Bethel, where he promised to be with Jacob. Jacob, you remember when I promised you 20 years ago that I would be with you, that I would bless you, and you see over these past 20 years how I have done that? Know that I am with you. God is also reminding Jacob of their past interactions. See, it's always helpful as we move forward in life to reflect back on where we have been and how God has been faithful. It's why we're doing our celebration tonight, to look back at how God has been faithful to us. And so Jacob was reminded of these past 20 years. God promised to be with Jacob and Haran, and he was. Jacob had experienced God's faithfulness. Even in the midst of difficult situations, Jacob had experienced God's faithfulness. So God then told Jacob to leave this land and return to the land of his kindred. Jacob, it's time to go. I'm calling you out of here. I told you I would bring you back. The time is now. As I have been faithful before, so I will be faithful again. As you have trusted me before, now you need to trust me again. Jacob, you will again worship me at Bethel. Jacob, the vow that you made, it's time to be fulfilled. Now arise, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred. There is an emphasis in here in the statement of God. It's an urgent command. Do this now. Jacob, now go. Don't Don't wait around. No diddle-dallying. Go. Time is now. And so Jacob explained all of this to his wives. And in verses 14 to 16, we see Rachel and Leah's responses. And they are a fascinating response. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, "Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do." They knew that there was no benefit for them to stay with Laban. They had seen all that Laban had done to Jacob. They experienced it themselves. He regarded them as foreigners and not family. Laban had sold them. He sold his daughters into marriage for work. See, the idea then was a dowry. So the husband-to-be would pay the father a bride price, and then the father would take some of that money and give it to the daughter so she would have something of her own to build upon. This still happens in parts of the world. This is still going on. It's a common thing in the Middle East where the husband-to-be pays money, pays the bride price, and then a dowry is what the father takes a portion of that and gives it to the daughter for herself to then build her wealth up. But we see when they say he treated us as foreigners, he never paid the dowry. He never gave anything back to them. He just sold them. See, Jacob worked, instead of paying money because he didn't have any, he worked for 7 years for Rachel, and then 7 years for Leah, and then 7 years for Rachel. And what Laban should have done, the culture dictated, was that as Laban accumulated that wealth, a portion of it would have been given to Leah, and a portion would have been given to Rachel. That's what a father should have done with his daughter. But Laban didn't do that. He took it all and he kept it for himself. He spent it, or he accumulated his own wealth. He didn't give any to his daughters. Now, isn't it interesting? Laban used custom, the custom of the area, the custom of the time when it benefited him. That's the reason he gave Jacob, why he gave Jacob Leah instead of Rachel. Custom. Jacob, you don't understand our culture. I don't know what it's like where you live, but in our area, the oldest daughter is married before the younger. So you want the younger daughter, you got to marry the older daughter first. When it benefited Laban, he relied on custom. But when custom didn't benefit him, he ignored it. There is zero righteousness in Laban. I hope by the end of our time with Laban, you realize that he was a total scoundrel. He was not a good guy. So Rachel and Leah understood all that had transpired. Jacob's wealth had been increasing while Laban's had been decreasing. And this is because God's providence. Laban wasn't faithful and God intervened. And so Rachel and Leah supported Jacob in his following God's command. Now notice that Rachel and Leah did not stand in the way of Jacob's obedience to the Lord. They didn't stand in the way. So often, spouses can be a hindrance in allowing God to work in their spouse or their family. I have had many conversations with guys who say, I want to serve in these ways, but my wife won't let me. She demands that I'm home. Whatever the list is. And so the wife won't permit the husband, or the husband won't permit the wife because they make demands at home. And this we see, spouses should be assets in encouraging the other to follow God's direction, not a hindrance. Now, to be fair, Jacob was Jacob was very forthcoming. He was very forthcoming with them and with the reasons he wanted to leave. He didn't hide anything. He didn't spring it upon them. See, this is what it looks like to lead well. Not just at home, but in general. This is what leadership is. It's leading, it's guiding, it's not demanding, but it's informing, it's teaching. And it's being obedient to what God has called us to be. So as we wrap up this section, a chapter in Jacob's life is about to close. We saw the first chapter. He was at home with his family, Isaac and Rebekah and Esau. We saw that chapter close. He then went to Haran, and he's with Laban, and this chapter is about to close. Jacob is learning to trust God's faithfulness. For us, this seems fast, right? It's a short part of Scripture. But remember, it's been 20 years that he was with Laban. The journey of sanctification is a long journey. We've done this in a few weeks. For Jacob, it was 20 years. So we look back and we remember what God has done in our life and how he has been faithful. It is a long road. We all screw up in so many ways. We all make mistakes, and we learn from them, and we look back and we see God's faithfulness. Remind your kids and your loved ones of God's faithfulness in your life and in your family. Set times to reflect. Again, this is why we're having our celebration this evening, to reflect and remember what God has done. These times are important because we can get so overwhelmed. We can get wrapped up in the present that we forget about God's faithfulness. We get bad news and we panic. What's going to happen? We worry about what God's going to do or not do. And we forget to reflect on how he has been so faithful in the past. See, when we forget, we become overwhelmed because we try to carry the weight ourselves. We get the bad news, we hear whatever it is, and we try to carry that ourselves. We try to figure out the unknown. We dwell on the wrong things. But when we remember God's faithfulness, when we keep our eyes on him, the author and perfecter of our faith, things get a little bit clearer, not because we know how it's going to end, but because we know the one who does, and we trust him because he is trustworthy and true. He sustains us, he carries us, and he gets us through because he and he alone is faithful.